There was a knock at the door. It was officers from the Ashton police station. They informed them that they needed to investigate some new leads after there was an anonymous tip, which had brought new information to the case, and they had come to perform a postmortem examination on his wife's body, which they did in his front room. Mary Ann Haig was born in Bolton as the second oldest child. When she was older, they moved to Ashton, where later in life she met and married the love of her life, Thomas Britland. The two married and moved to 92 Turner's Lane, a cramped terrace that was ideal for them, apart from the constant mice infestations. But it was good for them, and it wasn't long before they had two beautiful little girls, Elizabeth and Susanna. They were Thomas's and Mary's whole world, but money was tight. So when the kids were old enough to be left, Mary got a job at the end of the street at the factory. She worked as a cotton reeler by day and got a second job as a barmaid at night. Everything was good apart from the constant infestations of mice, as Mary Ann was concerned about the children, as the mice can carry disease. Years later, Elizabeth, Mary Ann's oldest daughter, joined her mother working at Turner's Mill at the end of the road, and her father Thomas worked all hours as a cart driver and a barman in the evening at Heaps Vaults pub nearby. The youngest daughter, Susanna, who was now 18, worked away in domestic service at a large home in Oldham. And around this time, which was popular practice, the family had taken out life insurance policies on each other. This was mostly due to cover the cost of funeral expenses if there was any surprise deaths. In February 1886, the local street was buzzing and there was much talk about Mary Ann and a neighbour, a family friend called Thomas Dixon. He was a married man who lived at 128 Turner's Lane, just down the road. The whole street talked about the closeness of their friendship, and one day Mary Ann's oldest daughter, Elizabeth, was coming home from work when she passed a few ladies in the alleyway. She heard about the rumours. She said it was nonsense and laughed it off. Soon, she became suspicious of an improper relationship and what that would mean for her dad. On the 8th of March, 1886, a few days after confronting her mother about the alleged affair, Elizabeth, Mary Ann's oldest daughter, became ill. Mary Ann rushed to her bedside and nursed her night and day for days. She did not get any better, and sadly, on the 10th of March, aged 19, Elizabeth Hannah Britland passed away. Dr. Thompson, who came to sign the death certificate, noted that she had died due to vomiting and heart spasms, but did not feel the need of an inquest. Mary Ann received a £10 insurance payout due to the loss, with one of the neighbours washing and making Elizabeth's body ready for the funeral. The neighbours stopped talking about Mary Ann after the loss of Elizabeth, as she was noted to have gone sombre and withdrawn. She was hardly talking, with many referring to her as that poor woman. She threw herself into work, and many thought that was her way of coping, hoping the routine of work would give her the relief from loss. Thomas, in his grief, like Mary, tried to bury his grief in work. On the 30th of April, she went out shopping to get items needed for the home, bread, vegetables, meat. But on the way home, she went to Kilvington's, the pharmacy, to purchase Hunt's vermin and insect destroyer. When the pharmacist asked if she was still having another go at trying to remove the mice. That evening, Thomas started feeling unwell. He started showing symptoms eerily similar to that of their daughter Elizabeth. Dr. Tucker came to tend to Thomas, helped by Miss Dixon, who tended to Thomas daily, so he was never alone. But 3 days later, sadly on the 3rd of May, 44-year-old Thomas Britland, too, passed away. On his death, Dr. Tucker came to inspect the body and to fill out a death certificate where he noted Thomas died due to epilepsy. Mary Ann thought this was odd, but again she received a £20 payout from her husband's life insurance. The financial aid was welcome relief, but offered little help for her grief. Sad and now alone, Mary Ann turned to her friend that nursed her sick husband, Miss Mary Dixon, the wife of Mr. Dixon, the man rumoured to be sleeping with Mary and one of her neighbours on Turner's Lane. Miss Dixon took her in and showed great empathy for Mary Ann, and they started spending a lot more time together outside of work. But when Mary went to see her friend on Thursday the 13th of May, when she knocked on the door, no one answered. Mary thought this was strange, as the previous night they had had tea together and ate bread and butter with mixed pickles. So worried by the silence, she let herself in and called out. She heard her friend's voice faint calling back, and Mary Ann rushed to find her friend, who was severely sick in bed. She rushed for a doctor and came back to her friend, followed by Dr. Thompson. Over the next day, Miss Dixon was showing the same symptoms of Elizabeth and Thomas. Mary Ann rarely left her friend, apart from going to work so she didn't lose her job, and Dr. Thompson tried everything he possibly could. But by candlelight, in the early hours of the 14th of May, 29-year-old Mary Dixon died, surrounded by Dr. Thompson, Mr. Dixon, and Mary Ann. Dr. Thompson noted death was due to vomiting and abdominal spasms. With her only surviving daughter working away, it seemed Mary Ann was now alone. And to make things worse, people were now acting strangely around her, as within a year period 3 people had died. And Mrs. Sarah Lord, who was the woman who had also lived on Turner's Lane, she was classed as an experienced woman, someone who has dealt with death and dying for many years. It was her role to wash the bodies and lay out the dead, and prepare them, while the funeral arrangements were being made. And she had now dealt with the bodies of Elizabeth, Thomas, and Miss Dixon. And she was suspicious over the similarities over the dead bodies. She was talking about the matter with a group of neighbours, and towards the end of the discussion, Sarah Lord said she would see things right and marched off down the road. Mr. Dixon was now without his wife. In grief he was at a loss, and when it came to burying her, he went to Mr. John Law, in which to plan food for the wake, which he agreed, and on the 15th of May, Mr. Law walked down the cobbled street to Mr. Dixon's home to discuss details of the wake. He arrived at the door and knocked. No answer, and so he knocked again. But when the door opened, it wasn't Mr. Dixon who greeted him, it was Mary Ann Britland. He expressed his condolences for her recent loss of her husband and daughter, and then Mr. Dixon came to the door and welcomed him in. While doing so, Mr. Law took off his hat and deeply expressed his sorrow for his loss too. After discussing the details of Mr. Law, he said his farewells at the door and turned to leave, when officers from Ashton police station turned up, as he said they needed to investigate some new leads after there was an anonymous tip. They had come to perform a postmortem, an examination of his wife's body, which they did in the front room of the Dixon home, with furniture being moved around before operating and removing major organs. They were sent away for testing, and a few days later, Mary Ann Britland and Mr. Thomas Dixon were arrested and taken to the police station. When questioned at the station, it was found Mrs. Dixon's body contained strychnine and arsenic, which was found inside the vermin killer that Mary Ann had bought on the 30th of April. And the police knew this because at the time, when purchasing poisons, chemists kept a poison register, when anyone who bought the product had to leave a name and signature. She was questioned over and over and over again, but she claimed her innocence. They questioned Mr. Dixon, focusing on his wife's life insurance, as they noticed She was insured by 2 separate companies, paying Mr. Dixon a total of £29. But Mr. Dixon was adamant he had done nothing to his wife. He loved her deeply, saying he would rather have her alive than the money. And when asked about Mary Ann, he said they were just friends, and the families had been friends for a number of years. Mary Ann and his wife had spent more time together and got a lot closer after the death of Mary Ann's daughter and husband, but he didn't think anything of it. After an investigation, they released Mr. Dixon with no charge. Because of the purchase of the poison, though, they arrested Mary Ann, and the police moved to dig up and test the bodies of Elizabeth and Thomas Britland. On the 22nd of July, 1886, in the centre of Manchester, the trial started, and the courtroom was packed with spectators and press. There was many who couldn't get in, so crowds started bustling outside the streets of the courthouse. Mary stood in the dock and protested her innocence. The prosecutors called Dr. Harris, who performed the autopsy on Thomas and Elizabeth Britland. He found no strychnine, but he did find trace amounts of arsenic. Mary Ann's defence argued that Mary Ann had no motive. When the witnesses came to give evidence, it happened to be the neighbours from the street reciting gossip that they had heard as fact. And apart from the purchase of the vermin poison, there was no evidence to link Mary Ann to killing all 3 people. On the second day, the jury was sent to deliberate, and after hours they still could not come to a conclusion, to where the judge said, "They do not need a motive for the crime, just a sentence." And with that, the jury went back and deliberated again. When the jury came back this time, Mary Ann was found guilty, to which Mary Ann turned white and cried out again that she was innocent, as the judge sentenced her to be transported to Strangeways Prison and hung. During this time, she was visited by her mother, Hannah Haig, and her daughter, Susanna Britland. It was said that during this visit, Mary Ann allegedly confessed to her crimes in front of her mother and daughter. On Monday the 9th of August, a distraught and terrified Mary Ann Britland was led from the condemned cell by 2 female wardens. She was in such a state she had to be supported by the wardens for the entire journey, from the condemned cell to the gallows. When they got to the gallows, 2 male wardens took over and half lifted and half carried Mary to the trapdoor. A noose was placed round Mary Ann's neck, and her feet stood on the trapdoor. She is noted to have said with a trembling voice, "O Lord, save me, and have mercy upon me." At this point, James Berry, the executioner, pulled the lever, and the doors opened below her feet. Mary Ann Britland fell several feet, with the noose breaking her neck and killing her immediately. Well, that will do it for today. But to let you know, Mary Ann Britland became the first woman to be hung at Strangeways Prison, and is one of the only 4 women to be executed there. And just to play devil's advocate and give some further information, the confession of Mary Ann in her condemned cell is only hearsay, and people confess all sorts of things under the right conditions. And the poisons that killed these 3 people were present in so many things at the time. Strychnine was often prescribed as medication, and arsenic appeared in nearly everything, from face powder to wallpaper. So its presence could not prove murder. And as for the affair with Thomas Dixon, this was never proven, and was denied by both parties. Also, if an affair with Thomas Dixon had been proven, then it's certain he too would have faced trial for the deaths. The judge in this case dismissed the need of a motive being required to convict, This possibly would stand as a miscarriage of justice. There are other accounts when the cafe owner called at Mr. Dixon's house to prepare for the funeral. Ann Britland just started talking about poison and basically confessed to the whole thing. I find this pretty hard to believe. If she had gone to all the trouble to be discreet and get away with it by poisoning her family members and friend, why would she blow everything in such a way? It doesn't seem to fit with her character. So, again, I feel this is just more storytelling than actual fact. The cramped terraces of Turner Lane mostly no longer exist, as they were slums with poor sanitation and were cleared in the 1960s. Also, one last thing. I'm actually related to Ann Britland on my mother's side of the family, and was actually told about this story by my grandfather when I was growing up. But as always, let me know what you thought of the story in the comments below, and if you think she was a mentally unwell serial killer, or if she was just really unlucky and it cost her life. If you are new here, don't forget to like and subscribe, as it does help my channel and I upload every Wednesday. That will about do it. Thank you for your support and take care.